Good morning. Let us gather ourselves in the presence of God. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, by whose Spirit the whole body of your faithful people is governed and sanctified, receive our supplications and prayers which we offer before you for all members of your holy church, that in their vocation and ministry they may truly and devoutly serve you. Through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Dios Todopoderoso y Eterno, cuyo Espíritu gobierna y santifica a todo el cuerpo de tu pueblo fiel. Recibe las súplicas y oraciones que te ofrecemos por todos los miembros de tu Santa Iglesia, para que en su vocación y ministerio te sirvan verdadera y devotamente, por nuestro Señor y Salvador Jesucristo, que vive y reina contigo en la unidad del Espíritu Santo, un solo Dios, ahora y por siempre. Amén.
Well, good afternoon. On behalf of the SEAT Conference Planning Team, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session about the third place. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, the Reverend Steve Lawler. He is the founding director of the Walker Leadership Institute at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis. And with that, Steve, I'll let you take it away from here.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Wonderful to be with you all today. This is a really exciting panel, and we're fortunate to have three great people with us who are doing really interesting work and will bring a lot of wisdom and insight to your own work. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then each of them is going to give a bit of an overview of some of how they approach this question that we have before us today. And then we'll have time for you all to ask questions, and we encourage you to put those questions in the chat space so that we can have a look at them. All right. So Father John, would you go first, please?
You bet. Hi there. I'm John Spicer. I'm rector of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Kansas City. It's a joy to get to be with you in this. I'm here, I think, because of my church's work in discerning how and how and why, basically, to create a third place, perhaps in a time when conventional wisdom might have said not to make something new. Anyway, we'll hear more later.
Great, thank you. Renato.
All right, thanks for having me. I'm Renato Matos. I'm a partner at an attorney at Capel, Barnett, Madelon, and Schoenfeld in New York. And my practice is primarily representing religious organizations on using development of real estate to support and expand the mission and ministry of congregations. We're looking forward to sharing a little bit of that with you soon.
Great, thank you. And Joshua.
Hi, welcome everybody. So excited for today's presentation. I'm Joshua Castano. I'm the Director of Community Engagement Services at Partners for Sacred Places, the national nonprofit focused on stewardship and active community use of historic houses of worship. I've been here since 2013, coming from a career and experience in historic preservation and community development before that, and here play a senior leadership role overseeing many of our programs and our consulting practice that works with congregations around engaging community and thinking about community-wide fundraising. Happen to be an Episcopalian, and I'm the treasurer of the vestry at St. Mark's Parish on Locust Street in Philadelphia.
Great. Joshua, as long as you're on, would you go ahead and say more about your work and how that connects to today's topic?
Sure, and I'm just gonna maybe share a couple of slides because I think this will help focus some of what the key pieces of the things that I want to talk about. So, and I'll keep this pretty brief so we all get a moment to do this. So, I already said a little bit about Partners and our mission. I think we're kind of unique in this way because we really are at the kind of the bridge between what we call the wider civic community and historic houses of worship. And so this is really important to the way that we understand making the case for historic sacred places, and also their ability to be community assets and to reach out to the wider community to become something that is a thriving community asset that is filled with and enriched by a wide range of activity. We really sometimes talk about maximizing the value of historic houses of worship. And this research that we call, that really gets to the topic of public value is really the foundation of our entire approach. And really, I think for us is in the background when we talk about what a third place is. Okay, so in the 90s, to do a little bit of time travel here, there was this really important question for our board, our members, our staff, which was, what's happening in churches outside of Sunday morning? What's happening? What's going on? Does anybody fully understand? Is there any real research on this? Do we really have data about this? How are congregations sharing an opening space? What cultural value are they bringing? How are churches playing a role in strengthening and stabilizing community? So we ended up doing research, and this was a really great project called Sacred Places at Risk. It was the first national study to look at the public value of historic religious property. And in fact, this was in conjunction with people like John DiIulio, who was involved with setting up the first Office of Faith-Based Initiatives under the Bush administration. And so this is really important for us, what's happening. And we found out a really surprising statistic. And this is, this trend has actually increased since then. So we'll talk about that in a second. When we did our research in 1998 in Sacred Places at Risk, we found that 81% of the people who were using the building each week were not members. 81%. So if we looked really at what was happening in a church every week, 81% of the people who were using it were not members. This was a huge finding. We also discovered that most churches were opening their doors, that they were hosting most of their programs in their buildings, that they were catalyzing thousands of hours of volunteer support each year, and that there was an economic impact to the work that they did. So we continued to build on that approach and that way of looking at churches and helping them and say, look, this is your public value. Does the community fully understand this? Are they aware of this? Do they know really the impact of what you do? So we continued to refine our methodology, went back to our research partners at the University of Pennsylvania and conducted another national study, the economic halo effect of sacred places, where we looked at a number of different categories of value and activity that congregations engage in. And that national study concluded that the average economic impact of a historic church, and this is a wide range of churches, some with very big budgets in schools, some very small parishes, but that Catholic, mainline Protestant, independent, but that the average economic value was $1.7 million to the wider community. So this is a pretty amazing fact, a really interesting fact. If you could think about a city, for instance, like Philadelphia, where you have over 800 purpose-built religious properties, just historic religious properties. So we're not talking about churches that exist in non-historic buildings. If you could say $1.7 million of average economic value for each of those, well, you're talking about a huge amount of economic impact, of activity, of strength that congregations support. I want to just focus on a couple interesting notes from that research as well. We looked at the number of visits, so who's coming to sacred places in that study, in this snapshot that we took in this economic halo effect study. And I encourage you, by the way, I should have mentioned this already, that you can find a copy of this study on Partners' website that you can download for free. So there's a copy of the economic halo effect study report there. We looked at 3.6 million visits. Okay, it's 3.6 million visits for the 90 congregations that were in the halo effect study. 11% were for worship. 11% of those visits were for worship. The rest were for the other categories that we broadly defined here. Community programs, which can include stuff that congregations were doing to serve and outreach to folks, as well as hosting theaters or art performances or school groups or AA and 12-step programs. It's, I mean, you know, the whole range. Anything that can happen in a church happens in a church, almost all good things. And education is another huge category, and other kinds of special events. So this is a huge and important fact for congregations to look at. When we talk to congregations about this, we often ask, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, you see that 11% there is for worship. What does that mean for you and for what you do? If you recall, just a moment ago, I mentioned that in our earlier study back in the late 90s, that we had looked at 81% of the people using the building were non-members. Well, that's actually gone up because when we did the halo effect study just a few years ago, with a more refined methodology, and we saw that number go up to 87%. 87%. So that's truly huge. Congregations really are third places. Now, we don't have a huge amount of time to get into a number of case examples, but I just want to talk about a couple of ones. Urban Grace in Tacoma, Washington is a really interesting place. Very cool. If you can tell, it's sort of, there's a small group of these kinds of churches that were built in urban centers in the early 20th century to look sort of not like churches, or to look like churchy office buildings and blend into the urban landscape here. And Urban Grace is one of them. Massive building. And when the current pastor took over, there is a sense of huge decline, a massive behemoth of a building that was certainly an albatross more than was an asset, but also this sense of burgeoning community activity in the city around them, and a kind of begging question: how can we get involved? What can we do? And Urban Grace realized that the building was a key asset for that their approach to stewardship and cultivating resources for stewardship of their building, celebrating its heritage, the heritage of the congregation and its legacy, that all these pieces added up to actually their role as an asset in the wider community that they could leverage, they could maximize if they made the connections with the wider community to create a place that they defined as a congregation that's open, that welcomes, that has an imagination for almost any kind of community activity that benefits and strengthens and contributes to the health of the community. And so this is a pretty dynamic, exciting place. Calvary Center in West Philadelphia is the de facto community center in that neighborhood. And this is a United Methodist congregation that weathered a really intense period of urban decline in that neighborhood, which is now kind of firmly within the boundaries of University City in West Philadelphia, and a neighborhood that's truly revitalized. But this is the community center for that neighborhood. There are people in and out 12 to 14 hours a day, every single day of the week. It's the kind of place where there are 4 worshiping congregations right now, actually 2 theaters, a host of permanent community organizations, a huge number of short-term uses, performing arts organizations, schools, education programs. Pretty incredible. And this was because of intense partnership with the community, of approaching the community to say, we can share in the stewardship of this asset, and we can share in the visioning together. We can have a conversation together about the visioning of this place, as a center that brings community together. And I will just say that when we worked with them recently to kind of understand where they've come in over 20 years of practice, to look at how they're managing and operating on a day-to-day basis, one of the things we were startled by was that this is a pretty generally secular neighborhood. And in focus groups, many of these people who are avowedly secular, volunteered information about their disinterest in religion, did so to ground their comments that this was different than renting space in or sharing space in a community center or some other civic place like a library or some place affiliated with the university, because congregations were here, because congregations were the stewards of this place. That congregations had defined a different kind of community, a different kind of place, and that is what added this kind of additional sort of value to it and made it different in terms of a gathering place, a multi-use site than other kinds of civic places. So, I have some other examples, but I want to give some time to my friends here on this. And we can talk about some of the strategies that churches can do for that. But I'm going to give kind of those examples there and how public value is such a huge part of being able to communicate with the community and then also create a conversation that allows them to be part of the visioning.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. Renato, would you go next, please?
Thank you. So I'm going to also share a screen here. Bear with me. Does everyone see that? Does that?
Yes.
Good. All right. And so, thanks, Joshua, for that. It actually leads off well to, the kind of work that we do, which is looking at a development project on religious-owned property as a way to support and expand mission and ministry of congregations. And so, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this on the handout here, but I will make it available if anyone wants to email it afterwards. But so what we basically are looking at with mission-driven development is property that may be underutilized. In the case, sometimes it's parking lots that a church might own or land nearby. In some case, actually, the property that a church building is in. And what we look at is to consider and reevaluate what is the current usage, and this plays off well with what Joshua was saying, is the amount of space actually being used, for example, for worship versus being used for other community type programs. Now, the difference here is to actually look at using the value there, especially it works well in cities like New York, where I am, whereas to consider, can we do development type projects with either residential or other school programs or et cetera, to create a new space for the church that's probably more appropriate for the current ministries of the congregation, but also to create a long-term income stream to help support that church in the future. And so with that, like anything, because of the nature of the religious organization, we always start with understanding what is the mission plan, right? And a lot of times when we start this process, it's pretty remarkable that many congregations haven't really thought about or rethought about what their mission plan in a very long time. And so when we look at what is our role in the neighborhood in which we serve, and when we start to look at that, we then also at the same time start to see what are the development alternatives for that particular site, so that we can then put a business plan and a mission plan together to help the congregation to flourish. So again, I won't go into this, but it's if you have some time afterwards to kind of look through what is the timeline on something like that. But what I really want to do is to give you kind of an example of a project that we've worked on. So Trinity Lutheran Church in Astoria in New York has a parking lot across the street from its church and also has a school building. The first thing is the school building, as many, unfortunately, parochial schools had closed. And so what we ended up doing with the school building is to work with a charter school that was looking for space and created an income stream, but also was something that had good mission value as well. But we had this parking lot across the street, and so besides using it for parking, there wasn't a whole lot of great usage of it. It wasn't really maximizing it. And so what we ended up actually doing is, if you can see here, is we had a ground lease. So a couple of things that the church needed. One is it needed funding to continue its many ministries. And two, it's a typical older church building that was not handicap accessible, also did not have great spaces for meeting that were, again, handicapped accessible. And so we did a ground lease on this site to a developer who built a new residential building on our site. We continue to own that land in perpetuity. But in addition to creating an income stream, and 30 to 40%, I believe, of that building is affordable housing. But in addition, we also had a 2,000 square foot meeting space and community room on the first floor that was to meet the needs of the congregation. I guess, not to spend too much time so that we can have more of a conversation, but based on, the topic here, thinking a little bit about how has COVID affected this? How has COVID affected the way churches might look at it? In fact, in a way, I think it could be a benefit to thinking through how we are as church, right? And for, the hardest and the most difficult thing for folks to grasp on these development projects is, because a lot of times it involves the demolition of a church building and the building of a whole new facility. And the first thing that, folks always say is, well, we want to have the same amount of square footage as we had before, right? And so if it was a 15,000 square foot church building, we need to have 15,000 square feet again. Except that we are using, oftentimes, the largest portion of our church building is actually the least used, right? It's the 1 hour, 2 hours on Sunday, and then the rest of the time, it's the other portions of the building are used for other community type uses. And so, I think as we look at this and how has COVID, affected, what's the post-COVID world look like is, we can clearly be church on Zoom, right? We can be church in a lot of different ways. And so rethinking, and again, I think what Joshua says with regard to historical churches, it works very well. And, but in terms of, what kind of spaces do we actually need going forward? How are we being good stewards of our assets? And making sure that we are creating a viable business plan that supports our mission plan in the future. So I think it probably was a bit of a wake-up call and maybe a good one to rethink, what ministries are important for our congregations and the communities in which we serve. And then the second question that has to be answered is, what kind of space do we really need? And so I'm happy to have more of that conversation after.
Steve, it looks like we may have lost your audio.
Father John, is that better? Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right.
There we go.
All right.
So, thanks. Yeah, John Spicer again from St. Andrews here in Kansas City, Missouri. This, what you see in front of you is the side yard of the building in which I'm sitting right now. This is sort of a case study, as I say, in why we chose to do what we did, which was adding a third place to our campus. What led to that, go to the next slide, Steve. What led to that was a couple of factors. It was our 100th anniversary in 2013. So we wanted to do something to mark that and to bless the community around us. We also had, as you see on the slide there, the building to the left, which it was just about as pretty as it appears in that picture. It was our youth and community center, but actually it was a repurposed neighborhood YMCA from the 1950s or so, and housed our youth ministry, and over time had housed some community classes and that sort of thing. But it was designed as a neighborhood YMCA, not as a community center and not as a church facility. So we needed to do something with it. Well, on the other side of that building, which you can't see, is a hiking and biking trail through this lovely neighborhood in which I sit, called Brookside. Very desirable location. And so the spot was very much full of possibility. Just to, as we heard a minute ago from Renato, sometimes buildings are not utilized as well as they might be, and can make space for something new. So that's the direction we wanted to go, was to make space for something new. But it wasn't just to replace the building, it was that we had and had been discerning an ongoing desire, impulse to embed the church more incarnationally into the life of the neighborhood. St. Andrews has been in this neighborhood for 100 years, but had sort of lost touch, it felt like to me, in being part of the life of this neighborhood of Kansas City. And so we wanted to try to do something that was going to intentionally take the church outside itself and into the community to a greater degree. So to do that, Steve, if you go to the next slide. To do that, there are various interests to balance, of course. We felt, well, we had to consider our own interest, congregational needs, of course, and in among those, there were three that sort of rose to the top. One was about trying to reach people who were not seeking the kind of model of church we were offering on the other side of the street, a very inherited model, to try to attend to the needs of the spiritually homeless among us, around us in this neighborhood. So there was that impulse, the desire also to be a resource for families, for young people, for children, of which there are many in this neighborhood. And as I say, to try to build relationship more intentionally with businesses and residents, organizations here among us, offering, as it turned out, space primarily for their use. So those were sort of our needs. The community need, we realized early on we needed to find out what the community needed rather than assuming we knew. So we talked with urban planning experts at the local university and did some surveying in the neighborhood itself, going door to door, as well as talking to folks in the parking lot at the grocery store, that sort of thing. And what it pointed to was the desire and need for community center space, because there wasn't one in Brookside. A lot of people and a lot of desire, like I say, for people to be here, but not really a community center space. Then, of course, you have to think about resources for doing something. We did a capital campaign in 2015, marking a little bit late, but marking the centennial. Had a goal of $5 million and raised 3.6, for which I am and was inordinately grateful for the 3.6. And it raises the question of what do you do when the plans that you have, at least on paper, aren't going to be realized completely to the extent that you wanted to. And actually, that was a very healthy experience of learning what enough was and learning to be faithful with the enough, at least to try to be. So then finally, we had to think about resources to support ministry using this facility and service to the community using this facility. So out of the money that was raised, we kept about $400,000 back for supporting ministry development in the new building, and the salary of one staff person was partially defraying the salary of one staff person whose time and energy would be invested in this. And you saw him just a few minutes ago. That was Zach Beal. Praise God for Zach Beal. He's made a huge difference here. And in addition to that, of course, as everybody is doing, I know we've been trying to make a culture of generosity and a culture of pledging a far more meaningful part of the wiring of the congregation as time has gone on, and that has gone well. But that's really important. So, Steve, if you would, the next slide. In terms of use, this is where the story is, of course. What does the church do here? We do the kinds of things you would imagine a church would do here. Our youth and scouts use this building, classes and group meetings and parish parties and parishioner events, that sort of thing. It's sorts of things you might imagine. And certainly that happened in the other building and do happen in the other building too. But what's been a great blessing to us to see is the extent to which the community has indeed embraced this space. We have community events and meetings and trainings and retreats from other organizations, other businesses, a number of events for individuals in the neighborhood, people renting the space out for anniversary parties or birthday parties or graduations or that sort of thing. Had game nights and a chess club meeting here. It served as a polling place, which is a great way to introduce people to the space of the church and also to see the church as a community civic resource. We've ended up hosting a number of wellness related activities. Over my shoulder now, I don't know if you can see them or not, but no, probably not with the glare. We're doing a Red Cross blood drive this afternoon. So if you hear things pounding off to the side, that's people setting up the blood drive. But blood drives, health fairs, ongoing exercise classes, recovery groups. When we were planning for this, there was an intentionality about it, blessing people in mind, body, and spirit, and that's worked out to be true. Partner with neighborhood business associations. There's a farmer's market in the lot and in part of the building on Saturdays. And there is a cafe space. The picture on the left there you see is of the cafe space. When it's not COVID time, free coffee and pastries and parishioners over here staffing the cafe just to develop relationships, build relationships with people. So that kind of community use. Then there are uses that it feels like to me at least, it ended up bridging the church and the community in some interesting ways. We created a monthly third Sunday series, basically kind of liturgizing community celebrations, church celebrations and community celebrations. They're like blessing backpacks and an Oktoberfest and pet blessings for St. Francis Day, concerts, that sort of thing. Basically finding reasons and opportunities to invite people in and share hospitality and have a little prayer and sing some songs. And it's been very well received, both by parishioners, but also lots of faces that we don't know each time we do this. The space, as you see in the picture on the right, the space hosts art exhibitions throughout the year, which COVID's not happening. And we're now in the midst of planning an additional worship experience Sunday morning that will be in this space instead of in the church space, and designed this way too, as not exactly a fresh expression in that sense, but certainly a more accessible worship experience, trying to tie into the openness and light and neighborhood orientation of this building. We're hoping that will happen sort of back to school time, depending on how COVID continues to go here in the Kansas City area, but things are looking good. So at least as things stood when things shut down a year ago, we were basically planning that revenue from rentals here would cover the building's operating cost. We're on track to do that. Not the staff person's salary, but the building's cost. And at that point, basically the building was being used daily and often at capacity, many days of capacity. Steve, with the next slide. So what have we taken from this? After 18 months of doing ministry and building relationships here, certainly blessings that we've been able to see. We have developed connections with people around us that we hadn't had before. It's been tremendous that way. I saw a definition somewhere, a third place being inviting places for people to sit and stay. And I love that. I love that framework, because that's, people do actually come and sit and stay and talk. And sometimes, not a ton of this, but sometimes they also become members of the church. We have had some, flow from one side of the street to the other. Not greatly, but there is authenticity in seeing what the community is like by coming and experiencing people being themselves and serving you a cup of coffee, as opposed to, how churches present themselves on Sunday mornings a little more formally most often. Partnerships, like I said, we've built some good strategic partnerships with the farmers market, with the Red Cross, with other health-related organizations, recovery groups, that sort of thing. And like I say, enough revenue at least to be able to cover the building's costs. That's what we were anticipating last year before the shutdown. The growing edges that we've seen, at least from my perspective, and from Zach too, he and I have been talking about this recently, particularly about capturing data, trying to learn who is here, how many people are here, whose interests are we serving, just trying to do a better job of finding out who it is who's using the space. And similarly, we need to do a better job of finding ways to engage people who are using this space, to give them the opportunity to see what the church has to offer. So we never expected that this would be a direct pipeline from community events to people showing up on Sunday morning. But for those who are interested, we need to find a way to be able to make that connection, a virtual visitors card, that kind of thing, to help them and us find each other when that's what they're seeking. Marketing, we've been fairly limited in the marketing we've done, so that's a growing edge too. There is some divided attention, some tension, I guess, about particularly for Zach, for the person in that operations director role, attending to this part of the operation, so to speak, as well as the aging church building, always crying for attention. And then there's the conversation among leadership about sort of the business side versus the missional side. And not that there aren't arguments about this or a lot of anxiety, but you do hear some leaders talking about how important it is for the space to cover its cost, and other leaders talking about how important it is to serve the community, and others talking about how important it is to draw people into relationship with the church. And so all those things are there. I don't think that's a problem exactly. It's just intentionally we have to hold them up and kind of look at them and say, yes, those are all part of our concern. So I would say overall, we have been very pleased with the connection that this facility has been able to let us offer to people in the community. Basically, we know our neighbors better, I think, than we used to, and I think they certainly know us and trust us more than they do. Because if you're in somebody's living room, so to speak, and having a cup of coffee with them, it's a different kind of relationship than the institution in the stone building with the stained glass windows that sits there, sometimes feeling a little standoffish. Which is not to say that those buildings, as you all were talking about before, that those buildings can't be just as inviting. It's not that they can't. It's just this was a way for us in our particular location to meet a particular need on both sides of this. It has been a great builder of relationship for us. I'll put the place's website in the chat too. So that's Steve. That's all I've got.
Thank you very much. Some great questions coming in. I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and this will close with this, but if you'd just start thinking ahead a little bit about what are the 2 or 3 key questions you feel like a congregation needs to be engaging to get to this whole exploration of third place. So put that on your brain, and then let also the people who are on this call know that in Whova, you will be able to find the contact information for all of the panelists. And that will be a great way for you to continue the conversation with them. And also some of the resources, the slide decks and things that you saw are here. So ahead of that question of the 3 kind of key things you would have people think about as they're moving into this, a question came in about how do you work with government organizations? And I would imagine that's partnerships of whether that's federal funding to community, your local city, or whatever your context is, what are some best practices you've found for engaging that? And I'll put one caveat from my own experience working in a congregation where we did a lot of this. There was always the question of the degree to which we could substantiate that we weren't using money from the government to evangelize, to turn people into members. So a little tricky stuff there. So any thoughts about how best to work with government organizations when you're doing this work?
I could just say really briefly, Steve, if it's okay. I would say you need some, actually, I think the first thing is you need some advocates and allies in the community who really understand your work, who are not, maybe it's the community foundation person, maybe it's someone from city council, maybe it's someone who runs a city agency or department, these kinds of leaders who understand your congregation and what you provide to the community. So they know what you have to offer and kind of have a sense of you, and they can be allies to help open doors, make connections. I mean, that's part of the process, I think, but that's a really important one to think about.
Great. Other thoughts about that?
I would just add one that's kind of more practical and one that's more on the legal side. And what we've done for a lot of churches that are looking to have kind of relationships, whether to get funding, et cetera, is to actually create a separate non-for-profit corporation so that you can actually interact with the government because the restrictions on religious corporations sometimes make it a little bit more difficult. So, that would be my kind of legal recommendation. From a practical point, again, with any of the projects that we work on, the first step is always what are the needs in the community, right? And interestingly enough, I know it may sound shocking, but the best way to find out about the needs in the community is to go to the community and ask, right? And sometimes it's actually approaching, your government and elected officials and saying, hey, what are you seeing? Because they're generally the people who are hearing kind of what are the needs. Is it, food, is it clothing? Is it educational programs? And, what we've done a lot and for the congregations that we represent is, for example, City of New York needs to do a universal pre-kindergarten program, and they need hundreds of spaces, right? Churches tend to have a lot of those spaces, smaller schools, et cetera. So, having that interaction and being in touch with your local elected officials is something that should be happening regardless, but it's to be aware of those programs, and then just to be very careful when you're structuring them to make sure that you're not running afoul of anything, and that's why usually the nonprofit helps out.
Yeah, I didn't want to get all the way down that, but Renato's absolutely right that the separate nonprofit is really important, because there's some grant funds, well, if you're thinking about grant funding particularly, that just won't be able to. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Father John, do you have ideas about what you learned in this process about relationship with various government organizations?
Just to flesh out what Renato was saying, in the layout of the property over here, the hiking and biking trail is on the far side of this community center, and the church is on the opposite side. It is the case that just the way the land lies, there's a need for communication between walking between the hiking and biking trail and the major street that is between the church and the community center. With some contacts in city government, the Parks Department, and cultivating some relationship there, they could see that it was going to benefit users of the hiking and biking trail if there was sort of an oasis, an opening from that trail leading along the sidewalk past the community center to the major artery on the other side. It was in the community's interest as well as in ours to have a space with a dog watering station and a bike repairs station. And so we provided those things, and they created the oasis in the Parks Department property to encourage people to stop and come by. So it was knowing that there was grant funding available for that, and knowing some people on the council and being able to match up how that was going to benefit the city is well as it turns out, it'd be nice to have, for us to have people walking by the building too.
There's been a strand in the questions about essentially how do you balance out the, charging people for use of space versus the expectation maybe, or the community sense of the space being free. Any thoughts about how to balance that out when you're thinking about doing this kind of work?
We get involved in this work a lot, and I would just say, from our experience, one thing is churches have to understand what's the value of your space. So we make a lot of assumptions about what we might want to charge, but what's actually the value of your space? What's the regular costs of using space here? And then you might also look at the market and look at comps. Now, this doesn't mean you have to key your fee schedule there, but you also should have a fee schedule. You should also understand what it is and have a policy about this, not a one-off where the vestry is making a heartfelt decision each time. You need to have some kind of structure to this. Then the second part is, and there's going to be variations from what comp, what kind of level of service people are going to get for using your space that's different from a commercial space and all that, for instance. But then the second part is what uses that kind of fit your mission you're willing to do at cost or a discount, versus the ones where because of the strength of that partner or because of the way that it doesn't really quite fit totally in the main bucket of your mission, where you're willing to charge the higher rate. So I think that's part of how you make that decision is, how does our mission influence the kind of place that we're building here, and how does that relate to it? But you've got to know your costs up front too.
Renato.
Yeah, I would just add that I think also knowing the nature of who it is that you're renting to. I think that whether there are nonprofits, for example, that are funded via grants or federal funding or state funding for the purpose, for example, of renting space. So I don't think we need to also be kind of foolish in the sense of just giving things away if, for example, they're being compensated for it. So and again, an example in New York is charter schools fund X number per pupil, right, for facilities expense. And that's kind of how we base what those rentals should look like when we're renting to a charter school. So I think, how it fit, as Joshua said, how it fits into the mission of the church, but also kind of what sources of funding they have, is key.
Thank you. I will add one thing, and then let's have each of you talk about the 2 or 3 key questions you would encourage people to think about. And it really does have to do with this conversation about context, really understanding where you are, what else is around, who else is in the space. And in some places, if there's a really, robust program, then, that program may be a model, even if you're not doing the same thing. So a quick example is working in a congregation where I was before Walker Leadership Institute. We discerned that community arts programs for kids were pretty thin. And so to Renato's point and other things that have been said, we were able to demonstrate by starting some arts programs that we were interested in that, and then funding started to come in from arts positive organizations, and there was always an administrative piece in there, and there was always a piece for building usage. So we sort of did the serve before you sell. I mean, we got into that before it was a revenue piece, but once we demonstrated that we were committed and we had done all the work to discover that was really a community gap, then the funding started to flow because we were actually already operating arts programs and began to partner with other arts groups because the location was critical, and that became really a big part of the outside revenue, was being an art space in a community that didn't have one, and especially focused with kids. So, all right. So, Father John, what are the 2 or 3 questions that you would encourage people who are with us today in this call to really dive into before they take whatever their next step is?
Well, and a couple of these are very obvious, but I'll say it anyway, because sometimes that's what we do in this business, right? Is we state what everybody ought to know, and I just haven't remembered. knowing what it is that you want to accomplish. I mean, from the congregation's perspective, what is the missional endeavor that you're seeking for this work to enhance? And as you said, Steve, the communities need knowing, not simply assuming, but knowing, finding out what the community actually needs by asking different stakeholders, not just the experts or not just the folks at the grocery store, but God willing, both. Another, I think, is something that's easy to forget from the perspective of the church as the institution that's going to solve the world's problems. And that is to see what the Holy Spirit's already up to and get on board and try to be a catalyst or a companion or someone to come alongside what God's already doing that's blessing people in the neighborhood. And then the other thing that occurred to me, which isn't really a question as much as I guess a goal to strive for, is patience. How patient can you be? Be as patient as you possibly can. If you have time, take it. We started talking about this project maybe 2012 or 2013. The building actually opened in 2018. There were moments I wanted to, lock the doors behind me and never come back again instead of having another meeting about it. But as it turned out, we learned an awful lot along the way.
Renato.
Yeah, time gets me in trouble a little bit, but if I think you have to ask the question internally, and this is when I meet with church councils and boards often in some of our older church buildings. And of course, those who have the resources and are financially well-heeled to do it, it works out well. But if you're on the leadership of your church and you spend more time and more of your resources, dedicated to your building than you do to your ministries, I think you need to kind of maybe question what the goal is. Because I've actually seen churches, for example, recently that we've represented that have sold their church properties, for example. And I have one that's renting a storefront who has tripled in size since they've done that 3 years ago. I have another one who just last week, we finalized a lease for a diner. And they moved out of a church building and they're renting a diner. And I'm excited to see how that works out. And I think we need to think a little bit outside the box. Again, I love historic churches. I mean, we all do. And if you're the ones who can afford to upkeep them, then I think we should. But those who can't, which in many cases are many, right? I think we need to rethink, what that was. It doesn't surprise me that John, when you designed your new building, there's a whole lot of glass there. It's a welcoming space to come into. And as much as you can make some of our older buildings still welcoming, as you said, when your first thing is a lot of stone and a big wooden door that's always closed, it's a little hard, that doesn't really, scream, come on in. And so I think we need to rethink, what church ought to look like, because I think we'd be well served by that, those who can't afford to. And the other thing is, if every year all you're seeing is deferred maintenance build up, that is going to hit at some point, and so if we don't have a plan to deal with that, because some folks can't do a capital campaign and raise $3.7 million, right? If you're in poor areas, you just can't do that. And so if you're just watching that happen and seeing the eventuality, putting our head in the sand isn't going to put it up. And so we should start to think through what that future looks like. Maybe it is selling the building, moving into a different type of space.
Joshua.
Yeah, I would say those are really interesting and I think provocative comments. They're good ones to get people really focused on this. I would say one resource that Partners has actually been developing is a guide to transition. So congregations that want to face the question of, does holding property like this as the owner make sense anymore, I think is really important. And there's a lot of things to think about here though, but I want to offer some hope. There are ways for congregations that are struggling with the stewardship of a historic building to really make the most of it, and actually through partnership and through thinking a little bit differently about the way they inhabit the building, or changing the way that they do that. Maybe somebody else needs to become an anchor tenant. Maybe they need to sell but retain a lease. That's important, because when we lose these churches or when they sell, we put cultural property at threat, which is about place and community and identity, but also the building is an asset for ministry. It is a place where congregations can host and create place that welcomes people, that supports a community, like Calvary, for instance, that I was talking about in West Philly. So I think there's some hope here, though, that through partnership, there's a way for congregations to actually tackle some of that stewardship question if it makes sense for them. So it doesn't have to be, I think, just, well, we can't, so we should just get out of it. I think maybe we want to, and is there a way to do that? And I think that's one thing to think about that's critical. So based on the work that we've done and the processes that we've helped congregations think about, I say there's two big questions. What are our assets? What are our assets? And what are the assets of our community? And the third part of that is then how can we make connections there? And a lot of congregations will want to, how are we going to solve this problem? What does our community need? And just basically spin wheels internally. And that, we really believe that the way to get at this is you've got to invite those people in. Even if the hole is coming through the roof, but you've got the community meal in the basement of that building, well, invite the city council members in. Invite the United Way executive director in, invite the people from the homeless shelter in and say, look, we're doing this ministry, but we're also struggling with this building. What makes sense here? How can you help? Is there some partnership here that can bring new resources to support what we're doing or expand what we're doing here? So I think you've got to understand what your assets are, and you've got to make space for the community and for civic leaders and stakeholders to be part of the conversation, not just sort of think we've got to mastermind a plan and then shop it around and get the community to buy in. That's a lot harder than actually having the community dream with you. Have them actually dream with you. I mean, you've got to understand who you are and your vision for ministry first as a congregation, but then you've got to bring them in to say, how does that shape the ministry of this place, if this makes sense for us?
Thank you. We're getting close to time. One thing I would add, and it came through significantly, I think, with each of our panelists and the stories they told and things they had to say, is probably the most powerful tool in doing this work is conversation. And if you are in the right conversation with the right people about the right things, you will find yourself moving into really wonderful possibilities of discernment. So thank you very much to our panelists and to those of you who are here in this space. Please do use your Whova app and reach out to those people on the panel that you would love to talk to. Go to their websites and enjoy the rest of this really rich day.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. At this time, on behalf of the seat planning team, I'd like to thank our moderator, the Reverend Steve Lawler, as well as our speakers, Joshua, Renato, and Father John, and Michael in the control room for their contribution to the conference. I invite you to continue this discussion on the Whova application, and we hope that you'll take a moment to fill out the short survey available in the chat box. Please join us for the sponsor partner exhibit break coming up next, and then following that, the workshop 3 sessions. Thank you everyone for joining us for this informative discussion.